Hey everyone, and welcome to today's watercolor color pencils and gouache painting tutorial. Actually, it's really a mixed media painting tutorial. Today I'm going to use the 60 gouache colors from Arteza and the 60 watercolors from Arteza that they sent me. Okay, to be honest, obviously I won't use all the colors because, well, I don't really need that much paint at all. But it is pretty amazing to have so many colors, and I think it's really a treat. You don't really need them, but if you have them, it's really cool. And I already tested a bit of the gouache paints. I was very happy with them. The quality and the pigmentation were great. And today I will use the watercolors as well. As you can see, they look pretty similar actually. So you have to read on the tube what it actually is. You have like so many different shades, and also get metallic paint. So you can actually see how many colors are in one package. It just doesn't end. It never ends. There are so many colors, and we still have colors here, so it just goes on and on and on. And yeah, so this was one package of 60 colors, and the same amount is in the other package as well. So it's completely overwhelming. And I will just pick a couple of them for my watercolor painting. Real quick before we start, if you want to learn more, I have lots of tutorials and real-time lessons available for you on my Patreon site, in which I teach you my technique in detail and step by step. In many of my videos, you even get to see my mixing process in a second camera window, and you can download the reference photo too. On top of that, all videos are downloadable and you can keep them forever. For just $5 a month, you get instant access to over 70 painting videos. That's pretty neat, right? And for only $10, you get access to another whole library of underrated but even longer real-time videos of all my recent artworks. If you have seen some of my works and you always wondered how I did them, then this pledge is the right one for you. Just visit my website and browse the tutorial section. There you will find a list of all lessons and real-time videos available. And for the extra portion of art, you might even fancy the art surprise tier. For only $5 more, I sent you a beautiful set of 3 unique art gifts each month. I chose the best artworks and illustrations that I created and turned them into beautiful magnets, stickers and postcards, which are not only wonderful decorations for your home, but also are rare collectibles, because once I send them out, they won't be available anywhere else and I don't reprint them. So get your art surprises package this month. So what are you waiting for? Up your painting game and join me now on patreon.com/leobarbrückner. And before I could start just randomly picking colors, I decided to make me a proper watercolor box with all the colors and proper labelings, and for that I bought 2 cheap watercolor boxes from Action. They cost only 98 cents, I believe. It was incredible. I don't know how they make these prices. It's probably not good that they were so cheap actually, but they had these beautiful tin boxes and each box had 12 colors in it, so I could just remove the initial colors and then afterwards add the Arteza watercolors. And I was super curious and I wanted to know how the pigmentation was, and actually they weren't that bad. Probably they will completely fade out with sunlight and they won't last very long, but the pigmentation wasn't bad, so I will probably just give the colors away to kids of our friends so that they can play around with them. I was a little bit sad that I had to kind of remove the colors, but yeah, I didn't know how I could make a proper watercolor box because it was Saturday and on Sunday all the stores are closed in Germany. I really wanted to make the video, so I had to quickly find a solution, and this was my solution. So anyways, these are the colors that I used. I also properly labeled all of them, and so I was perfectly set up to start my painting. To transfer my picture to my watercolor paper, I used my A3 Lightbox. For a lightbox you need a dark room, and if that is not an option for you, you can alternatively take a blanket or another piece of clothing over your head, and that works totally well too. It just looks ridiculous, but this is what I do sometimes. I don't want to miss this lightbox. I don't know why I hadn't bought a lightbox earlier, because it is so helpful if I want to have a clean underdrawing for my watercolor paintings. For my oil paintings, I don't need a very clean drawing, and then I just use graphite transferring paper, but especially for those delicate watercolor pieces, I need a very clean and crisp drawing. And I just use color pencils for my drawing, and then in the end I switch the lightbox off, change something in the drawing, then switch the lightbox on again. So in this way I get a perfect underdrawing. If you want to know what lightbox I'm using, I will leave a link for you in the description of the video as well. In this video I show you my participation piece for the upcoming Bad Apple Artist Collective auction, starting March the 28th at 5 p.m. Eastern and ending March the 31st at 5 p.m. Eastern. I will have all information and links down in the description for you. And in addition, as always, all materials that I used are down in the description as well. Okay, so before I could even start my watercolor process, I created an elaborate painting in Photoshop. And I started with a drawing that I did just on regular printing paper, which I scanned and imported into Photoshop, where I fully colored it. This process took me about a day. By the way, my initial drawing and the digital painting are available for my Patreon supporters. And I decided to go that route because for those imaginative and maybe even comic and manga inspired watercolor paintings, I really need to be sure how I want it to be colored, because in the past, when I would just start without planning it, most of the times I would ruin my painting, or it wouldn't be as good as it could have been. So in order to make the best painting that I was possibly able to do, I made a complete finished painting in Photoshop, which is kind of ridiculous because now I have an additional digital artwork too. But yeah, anyways, well, it's not perfect, so it's more of a rough sketch, but the face portion is pretty detailed actually. But anyways, so this way I was completely sure what I wanted to color and how to color it. For the references like the cherry blossoms and the water, I just picked additional images that would help me render those portions realistically or just convincing. Because I had no idea how the Arteza watercolors would behave, I chose the Fabriano hot pressed paper for this painting. In the beginning, I had the two options, so either I would paint on Fabriano hot pressed paper or on Arches cold pressed paper 300 grams, which I picked for my latest manga inspired Art Nouveau painting that you find on my YouTube channel too. And when I use this kind of paper, like the cold pressed one, I get the smoothest gradients and everything looks perfectly smooth and really perfect. The disadvantage, however, is that I can't really use gouache on this kind of paper because the structure is very rough, and also everything looks similar. So although I really love these effects where everything looks perfectly even and you don't have any rough watercolor edges, for this painting I really wanted to make different structures and textures. So for example, I want the face to look different than the hair and the cherry blossoms different than the water. And I also wanted to have watercolor edges to give me some beautiful abstract effects. So I decided to take the risk and take the Fabriano paper, where gradients are really difficult to do. But everything came different than I expected, so I will let you know in an instant. So as I said, I started with the face, and the Arteza watercolors were beautiful. I had no problem working with them. They were very pigmented actually. I didn't expect that. It was very easy to fill in the face portion, especially because the Arteza colors came in so many different pre-mixed colors, and I didn't really had to mix a lot of paint. So for example, peach, ballerina pink and apricot are all beautiful skin tones that I could choose for the face portion. However, then my plan was to layer the watercolors like I would do it with my Schminke watercolors. But then I noticed that the Arteza watercolors get lifted off the paper relatively easily, and so I couldn't really layer a lot. With the Schminke colors, once they are on the Fabriano paper, they are there. You can't really do anything about it. When I paint on Arches paper though, on the cold pressed, I can lift them off easily too, but on the Fabriano paper I can't. They are just in the paper and you can't do anything about it. However, with the Arteza colors, it was the complete opposite. So not every color has the same pigmentation. Some colors, they sink in the paper and they pretty much stay there, like dark blue tones or intense red tones, for example. So everything that is really intense, but all the lighter tones where you also have white pigments mixed in the paint, like apricot or peach or ballerina pink, all of these paints you can lift off very, very quickly. This is at least my experience. I'm not sure if this is like 100% correct, but this is what I felt like the color did when I painted with them. But this characteristic actually was super helpful for me, because even though I couldn't layer, I could lift off the paint, so I was able to make very smooth gradients in the face. So I wetted an entire area, and then I added a darker skin tone, like for example spiced apple, which was really nice dark reddish brownish tone, and then it would dry irregularly, and then I would just use a wet brush and then I go along the edges and then I would really smooth it out. So I use this technique for pretty much everything and also with all my other paints, but with these paints, because they get lift off so easily, I could make such amazing gradients that I was really happy with that. So I think it is depending on what technique you use, how you work, so that different characteristics of different paints are advantageous for your technique. And the result of this characteristic of the paint was that I didn't have a lot of harsh watercolor edges within the face portion. This was good, so I was really happy with the base of the paint, which I then used to apply a layer of color pencils on top, because even though I managed to make good gradients, I still wasn't happy, so it wasn't finished. So I had to work with color pencils on top. In the end of the video, I will let you know my final review of the paints and who I would recommend them and who I would not recommend these paints, but I will first focus on the tutorial portion. So my next step was to refine the face portion with color pencils. And as always, I use Polychromos color pencils and Luminance color pencils. They are wax based and add a shiny layer on your artwork, and they also blend the colors. So I would start with darker skin tones, and then in the end I would use a Luminance pencil in a similar color, for example burnt sienna 10%. This is like a very light, almost like a grayish skin tone, to add an additional layer on top of my Polychromos pencils, and it also removes almost all the grain. And since I decided to draw this portrait much larger than I would usually do with color pencils, I didn't have a lot of problem with grain, because when it is enlarged, the grain obviously gets smaller and all the details will be larger, and there you don't have a lot of problems with grain, which was beautiful. In order to get the face as smooth as I did, I recommend getting a couple of color pencils in skin tones. For example, I use burnt sienna, Venetian red, and ochre, and flesh tone, I think it's called. So I find it helpful to have a couple of those skin tones from Polychromos that I can vary when I draw. So I never use just one color and paint the skin. I always alternate them to make a convincing depiction of the skin. Then I continued working on the hair, and I used a couple of pink tones and mixed a purple tone out of one blue and one pink tone, and then I just filled in the hair portion. After that, I filled in the background, and I intentionally tried to make abstract effects and loose brush strokes. So here is a difference between the Arteza colors and, for example, Schminke colors. I think the pigmentation is wonderful, nothing to say against that, but I think the Schminke colors, with them you get better abstract effects on the Fabriano paper. On Arches paper I don't get any abstract effects whatsoever, but on Fabriano paper, when I use colors from Schminke, they make really strong abstract effects, and with the Arteza colors you do get abstract effects, but they are not that strong. So in the case I want to have really strong abstract effects, I would probably use the Schminke colors instead. But for this painting it totally worked with the Arteza colors, and so I just continued working on the hair. And for the hair, I just made up all those hair strands and decided where those individual strands would go. I already did that in the preliminary sketch. I didn't have to think that much about it, but in the shadows I just had to make up those hair strands and try to figure out where they would go and how they would look like if they were underwater, because actually this model is submerged in water, but you will see that later on. Then I continued with her beautiful cherry earrings and with the light hair strands. Here the gouache paint came in very handy because the watercolor obviously isn't opaque, and whenever I want to add an additional strand on a darker background, I could only use a dark color, but I also wanted to use light colors, so it was perfect to use the gouache paints. And for that I think I just used a couple of those pink tones with white and I think sky blue with white. I just mixed a couple of those pink and white tones to get a very light pink. I didn't want to have a very intense bright pink. Like her hair should look more like pastel pink tone. And I absolutely enjoy the contrast between the very thick and opaque gouache paint and the color pencil, which looks completely different from the structure, and also the watercolor, which is transparent and you always have a little bit of texture of the paper. So you have these three completely different textures on the artwork, which I completely loved, and I was so happy that this worked out. Sometimes I want an artwork to be completely look the same, but for this artwork I wanted those different textures, and I was so happy that it worked. And the gouache paints were amazing, perfect, like I'm really happy with them, except for one thing: the white wasn't as opaque as, for example, the Lascaux white that I use. But I didn't mind, I just used the white and added more layers, so this was okay. I really enjoyed the part where I added those water effects, these droplet-like shapes that follow her chin line and along the hair. This was the favorite part for me because here the water effect really only became visible, because for that you couldn't really see that she is submerged in water. Later on I added more darker layers so that the water effect gets a little bit stronger, but not totally strong. I still wanted it to be a very light painting. Then I worked on the butterfly and I just chose two colors. This Naples yellow was white and then the black and a light gray. I didn't have a very good reference photo for this, so I couldn't make it especially realistic, so I just went with the comic look, which I think fits very well to the overall painting. And then I worked on the cherry blossoms. So the cherry blossoms were especially difficult for me because I'm an impatient person, and when I think that I can paint something quick, I would always paint it quick, but cherry blossoms are not something that you paint quickly. You have to put in the time and the work, and in the first attempt I didn't do it and they looked very rough and they didn't fit at all to the painting and I hated them. So I had to completely, and I used color pencils and everything, but if I would just have put the time in the beginning in those cherry blossoms and just render them according to the reference photo, I would be perfectly fine. But I rushed it and then I had to correct it, and then it took even longer. In the end, I'm very happy now with the cherry blossoms because I used gouache paint to add another layer on top of the cherry blossoms. I just rendered the slight variations of color values that each individual blossom had. For example, there is a light pink and a light gray and there's white, and sometimes there's a different tone. And I didn't paint them realistically, instead I painted them a little bit in a cell shading method, which looks so beautiful. In a future painting, because the cherry blossoms were so challenging, try to paint them very realistically. But for this one I decided to go with the cell shading technique, and with gouache paint this is probably the only technique that you can do anyways, because you can't do any gradients with gouache. I don't know if other artists have found out how to do that, but I can only work in a cell shading method. So I would just put one color next to the next color and just don't make any gradients, because the gouache paint, it dries so quickly that there's not really a way to make a gradient. At least in my experience. If you know how to do that, let me know in the comment section. Then in the end, I worked on the leaves of the cherry tree. Here I applied the same cell shading technique. I started with the darker areas of the leaves and also with the veins that go through every leaf, and then I would pick lighter green color and add them on top, and this looked so beautiful. I'm really in love with this cell shading look that those leaves have in the end, especially because it's like a contrast to the rest. I really like the contrasts in painting. When everything looks like cell shading, I might be a little bit bored, but here I have the face which looks very smooth, and there you don't have any cell shading. Then there is this more or less abstract background with these watercolor effects, and then you have the cherry blossoms and the leaves with the cell shading effect. So I really like this painting in the end. It really worked out, but it took me a long time and it was very challenging. Yeah, so I'm really glad I didn't mess that up because it was so difficult for me. And if you like this process and you found it helpful, join me on Patreon at the $10 reward tier, because in April I will have this painting available as a real-time video for all my $10 Patreon supporters. I will upload the complete process from start to end, which is probably around 7 hours long. You can download it, you can follow the complete process and check how I did every individual step and learn from it. It will not be narrated because 7 hours is just too long for me, but you can watch the process and pick everything that you find helpful to improve your own art skills. And now comes my review for the Arteza watercolor and gouache paints. First of all, I was extremely positively surprised how pigmented and how wonderful these paints were. I would say they're not as good as Schminke, but if you are a beginning artist, or you just want to try them out, or you just don't want to spend so much money on watercolors because maybe you don't paint that often with watercolors, it is such an amazing deal. When you buy one tube of Schminke watercolors, for example, it will cost you around 5 or 6 euros, and here you get 60 watercolor paints for around 46 euros, which results in 70 cents per tube. So this is just a really good deal for watercolors. And in addition, you also get a coupon code that can save you 10% off your whole purchase, which is valid till April the 15th, that you can find in the description as well. I can paint with them almost as good as with Schminke watercolors, and in some occasions even better, because I can lift them off better from the paper. So if you have already Schminke watercolors, you don't really need them, but you can just try them out. And the same with gouache paints. If I knew that they were that good, I would just bought those gouache paints instead of the Schminke ones, because I don't paint that often with gouache, and I only use gouache to correct my watercolor paints, so I don't do a complete painting in gouache. I only do them to add a different texture on top of my watercolor paints, like with this painting, or to correct certain things, just to try things out. And it's amazing. So the gouache paint was very opaque except for the white, but the other paints were perfect, and it's so cheap. Like, I like the watercolor and the gouache paints more than the acrylics. They really surprised me because the quality was really good, especially for this price. Again, if you have already 100 colors from Schminke, don't need them, but if you are starting out and you just don't want to spend so much money on paint, it's really a good deal. I think they also have smaller amounts. This was the 60 watercolors. I think they have smaller amounts. Just check their website. I will have all links to the materials, as I said in the beginning, in the video description, so there you can just check it out for yourself. I don't know how they are regarding to light fastness, but all watercolors, even the good ones, will fade if you put them under direct sunlight, so this is pretty normal. But yeah, you can do tests and check it out for yourself. I can't really say anything about it. If you know it, just let me know in the comment section. I called this painting Sherry, which is a simple title, but I really liked it because I wanted to have the contrast in this painting. Like, I have a contrast between the different textures. The painting is inspired obviously by anime and Japanese subjects like the cherry blossom and also the style of the painting, but then I want to have an American word for it because I wanted to have the contrast between the two cultures that inspire each other. So I took a really simple name, Sherry, to juxtapose with the very detailed and complex composition of the painting. So you have this American title and the Japanese inspired subject, and I think it's perfect. So I could go with a very like Japanese or just Asian name, but I don't know, I think it's really like a pop art painting. It's like a comic, a manga. It's like all of these things together in one artwork, and I really love it. I hope you like it too. So this was it for the video, and I hope you enjoy and liked it and you could get something out of it, I hope. If you did like the video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, leave a comment and subscribe to my channel. See you in the next one. Bye bye!